I recently watched a video on the Modern Day Debates YouTube channel, which is a channel I don't normally watch, but I saw the thumbnail, it piqued my interest, and the debate was capitalism versus socialism. Ben Burgess versus David Friedman. David Friedman is an anarcho-capitalist, a very hardcore libertarian. He's written a number of books that are very respected in that tradition. Ben Burgess is a Marxist, a communist. He does videos for Zero Books. He's also a PhD, and so they're both professors, both PhDs, both very respected in their own fields. And you look at that and you think, you think, how further apart can you get on the political spectrum? You think of like the political compass test and the one with the four quadrants, and the communists are up in like the top left corner and the libertarians are like down in the bottom right. They're as far apart as they can possibly be. And certainly to kind of the newbie to politics, like libertarianism and communism is like the ultimate polar ends of politics. But what I find interesting about these debates, and this is kind of why I don't really pay attention to debates anymore, or I'm not as interested in them as I used to be, is you listen to this and right off the bat, like the first couple of minutes, I mean, they've agreed on all the fundamentals. They're both for human liberty, they're both for freedom, they're against tyranny, they're against the imposition of collective identities, collective will on people. And I mean, obviously you expect this from a libertarian, but I think I think the right often misses the mark on Marxism in terms of their critique of it. Their critique of it is that it's authoritarian. It leads to abuses of power, genocide, all this kind of thing. It's the PragerU, the libertarian critique of it, the same critique that David Friedman was making. And there is something to that. Obviously communism has always turned into despotism, and it's been very violent, revolutions and so on. But if you want to get at the core of the ideology, I think that does miss the mark, because I mean these people, despite what PragerU will say, someone like Ben Burgess doesn't want to like genocide loads of capitalists that disagree with him. He doesn't want like millions of people in gulags. I don't think he does. I actually think he does believe in human freedom and liberty, and he wants a prosperous world where people aren't standing in bread lines. He does want a utopian, prosperous world where repression and all these things aren't necessary and the state withers away. But this is where the critique, I think, from the right towards the Marxists often misses the mark, because you could laugh at this and say, oh well, not real communism, all the failed experiments that were dictatorships, I guess that wasn't real communism. But I mean, what matters is, regardless of if it's the case that communism will always turn into dictatorship, regardless of if that's the case, if you want to critique the ideology, say to a true believer, I mean, they certainly don't believe that, and they have a conception of communism that's different from that. And if you read what Marx wrote about communism, he wrote very little. Someone has said, I think it was John Michael Greer, maybe he was quoting someone else though, that Karl Marx, everything he wrote about capitalism was correct and everything he wrote about socialism was incorrect, something like that. And it is true, 99.9% of his work was a critique of the system of capitalism, discussion of history, political economy and so on. There's very little description of what a communist society would look like. But when he did write about that, the few pages that he did write on the communist society, that would be the end of history. It's not a Stalinist dictatorship. What it is when he describes it is this very it's language that we wouldn't really associate with communism. He's talking about that, in the morning a man can go and fish, and then in the afternoon he can tend to his cattle, and then in the evening he can be a scholar and he can read philosophy and he can do some writing. That when the means of production are controlled collectively, that everyone will have ultimate freedom. And freedom for Marx is creative expression. Marx does think that we are separate from the animal kingdom, that we are separate from nature in some sense, and that we have the potential for creative expression. We have the potential for creative work. That's really what makes us human. And so Marx's idea of freedom is the ability for each individual to achieve the totality of human goods. It's not exactly a very negative idea of freedom. It's not exactly the negative liberty of a David Friedman that just says, well, leave everyone alone, don't interfere with them directly, and then they can sort of decide whatever they want. We're not interested in ends or whatever. Marx is looking at freedom in a more totalizing way. So the Marxian conception of freedom is freedom from alienation, and freedom from alienation means the freedom to creatively express our will over and interact with the world. So freedom from alienation towards liberation, and that's really the disagreement with the right and the left on the spectrum, is it's liberty versus liberation. The left is interested in liberation, the right is interested in liberty, but it's quite a slight disagreement. If you think of some of the ideologies that could be represented in these debates, and they have much more fundamental disagreements. The same thing happened when Vosch debated Stefan Molyneux. In the first 5 minutes they agreed they're both libertarians, they both believe in individual freedom, they both want to maximize individual freedom, that's how they judge the good of everything, they both want economic prosperity for everyone. And then after that, it's just kind of a logistical argument. One side argues that, well, the market is the best mechanism to liberate people because we have these examples and this mechanism works this way. And socialist says, well, markets lead to, the growth of a capitalist class and wage slavery and exploitation, and people lose freedom through exploitation. They lose freedom through alienation from their labor, from other humans, this kind of thing. And this is kind of logistical argument. They're both arguing really about how to get to the same end, I would argue. And I remember disagreeing with a communist on Twitter or something, and someone replied and they were like, look at this silly person that you're arguing with. They call themselves a libertarian communist. What a ridiculous label. What's going on in the world that we have libertarian communists? But I mean, it makes sense to me. I mean, the people that call themselves communists, I mean, you don't hear them really. I mean, there's very few true belief in Stalinists, if I meet a communist that doesn't believe in all of the social libertine stuff that's become popular in the last 2 or 3 decades, stuff that was rejected by many communist countries. Stalin came into power and he banned gay marriage that the previous Bolshevik government had made legal, and he got rid of degenerate art and sort of returned to more traditional social norms, all this kind of thing. But communists in the West are certainly very libertarian, but I'd argue that that's kind of more true to what Marxism is. Marxism was always about liberation from collective identity, liberation from alienation. It was always about getting to the ideal mode of individual self-expression. And this is really, I think, the problem with debate is we think that, this guy is so based, he's got all the right beliefs, he's right about everything, I agree with his whole worldview. Therefore, he's gonna I'd love to see him debate, I'd love to see him debate Destiny and destroy him or something, and then people get so frustrated because somehow, Destiny and Bosch, with sophistry, they're considered such great debaters. But I mean, the thing is, when you enter into these debates, I mean, the fundamental questions in terms of values, in terms of ethics, in terms of epistemology, are left out, or they're dealt with in the first 5 minutes of discussion. Normally Destiny will debate someone and he'll say, well, okay, you're against abortion. Well, we have to get our fundamentals down before we discuss this. And I'll say generally that what makes people happy is a good thing. And the guys arguing it will say, yeah, sure, I'm for happiness. And then they'll start debating, and it turns into this very instrumental, kind of pointless debate. It just, it becomes this logistical debate where then it goes to like, let's go to the peer-reviewed research and say say how this thing turns out. So, I mean, what happens when you lose a grounding, a sort of collective grounding for ethical discussions? And this is really largely, I think, a result of individualism. Individualism is the liberation from the collective. It's the liberation from the imposition of collective values, collective hierarchies. Individualism, as it progressed, was really about desacralizing social orders, institutions, and hierarchies and conceptions of the world that were a limit on the individual. We always had this understanding of the great chain of being that the traditionalists talk about a lot. That was done away with, and what you're left with is this very solipsistic way of looking at things where everyone has their point of view and each is as valid as the other, and you get extreme relativism. But what you observe with these debates is that in that absence, in that void, without some great metaphysical order that you ground things in, all that you're left with is instrumental reason. In a totally materialistic, value-neutral world, where it's all just opinions, what you're left with is is instrumental reason. And you can just see this in the mechanisms of debate. It's like, okay, we're going to have a debate. We have very different perspectives. You're a liberal, whatever. Let's say, I'm a traditional Catholic or something, and we're going to have this debate, and we have very fundamental different views on everything. But we'll agree that human happiness is a good thing. And then once that's your kind of your only premise, I mean, it just turns into people like Destiny, like Vosh. It's obviously off the table is the idea that there are sort of forms of transcendence or spiritual life or heroism that have greater value than happiness, or that provide a greater kind of happiness than we normally think of as happiness, which is someone to be sort of satiated and self-actualized and all these kinds of things. That's kind of off the table. So all you can really do is just look at sort of logistical economic arguments for how best to give comfort and freedom to the individual. So I mean, the problem isn't so much that everyone has the wrong beliefs or things are so polarized. I mean, the fundamental problem really in the West today is that we don't even have a basis for a coherent discussion about ethics, about politics, about any of these things. I mean, when there was a referendum on abortion in Ireland and everyone was discussing abortion, I mean, the debates were just completely pointless, because one side would go up and say, so the pro-life side would go up and they can't say that, well, I'm a Catholic and I believe that objectively killing is wrong, it's sinful, and that has been decreed by God, therefore it's objectively a good thing to behave in a way that's in correspondence to that. It's objectively evil to take life, and life begins at conception. So your rationalist atheistic arguments for this, I don't accept them. I don't accept your premises, I don't accept your reasoning, because I believe my faith is true. Now that's the honest approach, right? And the honest approach of the pro-choice side would be to say, look, yes, technically it's life, but we have more of a utilitarian conception of things. We don't believe that there is some objective commandment floating in the ether that taking life in all situations is wrong. We take life all of the time. We eat animals, whatever. The fetus has less consciousness than some of the animals we kill. It's less capable of feeling pain, and we don't think that humans are special in some kind of metaphysical way. We don't believe in like a soul. We don't see evidence for these things. So we're making a basic utilitarian argument that if it prevents suffering for the mother, then we should prevent that suffering and we should let them have the abortion. That would have been the honest approach to this debate, but you never heard either side say that. Even the hardcore traditional Catholics that were pro-life never said this is bad because killing is sinful. Alright, that never happened, because to enter into public discourse, everyone has to sort of agree on a basic kind of epistemic starting point that's somewhat acceptable, that allows you to enter into the discourse. And so what it turned into was the pro-life side would say, well, oftentimes the mother is happier when she doesn't get an abortion. We have so many cases where instead of getting an abortion, they seek help and they raise their child, and they're so much happier that they didn't abort it. We have so many stories of this. Or they don't mention religion at all, but they say, taking life is just wrong. Why is it just wrong? Well, who would want to taking life is like the worst thing you can do. It's terrible, as if that's sort of self-evident. And the pro-choice side would say, well, look, of course we don't want to take life. Of course we don't think that a fetus is of the same worth as one of the animals we slaughter for food. Of course we don't think this. No, we're just we're concerned. We have this specific case, this terrible case where this woman died due to treatment she couldn't get because she was pregnant and they couldn't give her an abortion, and we have to sort of fix this problem, and we have to deal with this issue of so many women suffering through this. But it was constantly this kind of utilitarian, instrumental reason approach from both sides. The pro-life Christian traditional side were forced to sort of bring themselves down to making an instrumental argument for something that ultimately is not based on instrumental reason. Okay, if you're purely going on instrumental reason, if you don't think that human life has any significance, that it's somehow like ultimately separate from animal life, then you're not going to have. If you just start with instrumental reason and what will create the most happiness, what will lessen suffering the most, this kind of negative utilitarian way, then these arguments about like, well, some women end up happier from not having an abortion and we should put more money into mental health stuff, it's like, that's fine, but ultimately that argument, it does lose out to the instrumental argument of the pro-choice side that says, look at the thousands of women that have to go to England to get abortions, and look at the rape and incest cases and all this stuff. It does lose out. So they were always going to lose on that playing field. It's kind of obvious. And this is the thing, is individualism has this kind of self-perpetuating nature to it as well. It's not just, we see the new trend, whatever it is, in wokeness, and we think, this is like, sometimes there's like too much of a top-down approach, like this is all being created by the bankers or whatever. But there is this just self-perpetuating nature to liberalism, to individualism, where, for the men that were formulating individualist ideas 2 centuries ago, there was a lot of things that they took for granted that then their children, their children's children that were brought up in more of a current of individualism didn't have and didn't take for granted, and wasn't just there presupposed in their minds, but was presupposed more was individualism. And so it does kind of perpetuate, and you see it in the nature of these arguments, that as these things disappeared, then all of the public conversations, all of the debates start to presuppose these new, more radical values, and it just kind of goes on, and you head down the road of this project of liberation, sort of inexorably. But I don't think it's correct either to say that, well, the problem is just everyone's a moral relativist, and no one, it's just complete moral nihilism. Nothing is bad, everything is fine. That's like how these people view the world. These leftists are complete nihilists. They just want everyone to, they don't care about anything. They have no objective standards. In a sense, it's true, but there's something presupposed in there which sometimes they won't discuss themselves. But here's an example, right? Destiny in all his debates says, I'm for whatever, I'm for happiness, I'm for what makes people happy. That's how I'll judge the abortion debate. I'll say, well, It's making these people very unhappy to have kids against their will, to have to suffer through this. It increases happiness if we allow abortion and we allow them not to have to deal with this trauma, albeit maybe it causes some suffering along the way, but ultimately it's greater for happiness, right? So that's his basic sort of starting point. But it's not really, it's not quite just happiness for him. I mean, if it was just about happiness, if Destiny or someone like that was purely, I'm just for whatever makes people happy, well, the statistics are in, right? As things get more liberal, as societies become more individualist, right, you have greater alienation. The breakdown of communities brings all sorts of problems. You have greater suicide rates. The use of drugs, alcoholism, prescription drugs. I mean, like half America is on psychoactive medication for something. The amount of suicidal ideation is always going up. All these things, even like feminism, has women's liberation made women happier? Well, if you're going to be someone like Destiny, who's a complete empiricist, who just looks at the facts and the data and the peer-reviewed research, well, you look at, and there's, certainly correlation isn't necessarily causation, but a lot of times it is. And it does seem like the more people get liberated, the more the project of liberation goes on, the more alienated they feel. Marxists are very concerned about alienation, but the more alienated they get, people get liberated into becoming wage slaves and they become more unhappy. Families break down, people feel more alienated, more alone, people grow up with more pathological issues. And all of these things just correlate nicely with the growth of individualism and liberalism. You don't see them as much in less developed countries, you don't see them as much in countries that are illiberal. And it seems like that, the studies, the dates, the data, the facts, they're all in, and we kind of know that really, if you just want people to be happy, then maybe just destroying everything. Let's just destroy all our traditions, let's just destroy all our social norms, let's just destroy belief in anything higher. It's probably not the best approach to make people happy, right? So there's something going on there. It's not just about happiness for these people. They're not happy for you to just be happy being like a traditional Catholic and living in like an ethnically homogenous community and having backward, ignorant beliefs. That's not, you might be happy, but they're not happy with your happiness. There's something else going on, and really what it comes down to is, if any issue comes up, like when something like gender dysphoria is being debated, Destiny will say, well, generally, I think we should let people make their own choices and find what makes them happy. Let them sort of make their own mistakes. So it's not, it's not happiness at any cost. It's not like let's be paternalistic and tell people what's best for them and make them happy. It's very much what supervenes on that. What's more important than happiness is, they would say, allowing people to find what makes them happy, allowing individual choice, the more libertarian minded would say. But really it's about this idea of self-fulfillment and of authenticity, right? Someone may be happy as a sort of backward, ignorant thinking, traditional Catholic that's never left his village. But it's to them it's not really authentic. What's authentic is self-discovery. It's the expression of individualism, right? That takes greater that's more important than just happiness, And they will glorify, the person that is constantly struggling with themselves. You see this in how quick now people are to talk about all of the labels they have for their various mental problems, and they'll have it like in their Twitter bio and all this stuff. It's like a real part of their identity. And they kind of celebrate this thing. This thing is more and more celebrated, like Tumblr and all this stuff, that the great struggle anymore isn't like with some outside force. It's not good versus evil. It's this internal struggle where you kind of struggle with yourself and you struggle to overcome the boundaries set by society, and you struggle to truly be who you are and to truly be your authentic self. So more than happiness, more than freedom, authenticity and self-discovery really is what's valued, because you can say authentic, right? And when I think of authenticity, I do think of things like a Latin mass, that seems authentic to me. A homogenous community that has maintained traditions for hundreds, thousands of years, that is kind of separate from the rest of the world. There's something authentic about that, right? There's something authentic about folk music. But to them, authenticity really means self-discovery. And this is where, this is like where the top-down elite thing comes in, because yes, individualism self-perpetuates, but also you had this shift in the early 20th century with the modernists, with people like Nietzsche, who people on the right like, and who is obviously a fantastic thinker, but you had this shift of people like Nietzsche, Baudrillard. Oscar Wilde is really the great exemplification of it, that authenticity became equivalent to self-expression, and self-expression became equivalent to self-discovery. So, with the perpetuation of liberalism and individualism, what that comes from is the destruction of old orders, the disenchantment of older modes of being, the loss of the heroic way of looking at life, the heroic approach to life, and the move to what Nietzsche calls, this pitiable condition of the last man that's purely concerned about comfort. Now, I'd say that this is the ethic of the merchant class that was being imposed on people. This was the merchant class doing away with the priest caste and the warrior caste. The ethic of the warrior class and celebrating the heroic, that's done away with, that's deconstructed, that's gotten rid of in favor of a more individualist way of looking at things. The priestly class, their metaphysics, scholasticism, these traditions of European thought, that's done away with in favor of other ways of looking at things. So this is, the merchant worldview is really imposed. But what you get with the modernists is, they're adapting to the great economic, technological change of the time, and they're looking for authenticity, and they're trying to kind of push the contradictions of modernism to their extremes, to sort of, to try and kind of transcend them and find something in the contradiction. But what you get really a lot repeated throughout this is this idea that life is about free expression, and the ideal life is the artist. The artist is the ultimate expression of what it's all about. It's self-discovery through creativity, through creative destruction of old norms, and through expressing their true self, their authentic self, and so this is where you get the destruction of old approaches to art. It's like, well, why write a novel in this traditional form? Why not write it stream of consciousness? Why make art to be beautiful? That's kind of an imposition of the collective will, the collective identity of old standards on us. Why not just make art that's pure self-expression, that's coming from this sort of visceral place, that's like pre-rational, and it's completely an expression of my will? Why should the higher man be subject to the morality of the herd? So it becomes about the expression of will, the expression of creativity. It becomes about self-expression as a means of discovering who you are. You express these things, you engage in creative action, but it's to discover your authentic self. So modern individualists, liberals, they have this very instrumental approach to things, but they're not true relativists, and you can even look at like some of the Nietzschean strands of thought, and you can think of like Foucault or someone that deconstructs everything, and will even deconstruct the self, the conception of the self, but still what you're left with is, when you deconstruct all hierarchies, all other modes of being, ways of seeing the world, what you're still left with, even if you pay lip service to deconstructing the self, what you're ultimately left with is just raw expression of the self. Once you've deconstructed everything, what's left is your will. and you're left with this kind of stern-right way of looking at things, where everything is a spook except my will and the immediacy of my will and what I want and how I can shape the world and be creative with the stuff of the world through my will. And that's really where the current of individualism and relativism leads. You know, the contradiction of relativism in terms of how it plays out is it relativizes everything, but what's left is the relativizer, the self that is doing the relativizing. And what you end up with is just this anthropocentric justification for the irresponsible, or the autonomous, completely autonomous from any sort of social responsibility or collective or higher ideal. You're just left with the expression of the will as the moral good. And so that is the issue we're grappling with, is that this ethic of self-expression, of discovery through self-expression, and of authenticity that is very individualist, that is very destructive in terms of suddenly everything is a barrier to that. You know, when the only good is self-expression and liberation through, transcending impositions, what you're left with is David Friedman arguing that the best way to be liberated from the social and be liberated from collective identity is through the market mechanism, because the market mechanism brings prosperity and brings individual choice and brings institutions like private property that protect people from tyranny, and people will ultimately choose freedom and self-expression. People flee from communist states to capitalist states because they want the freedom to self-actualize themselves. So what you're left is the right arguing that the market mechanism is the best way to a kind of transhuman future devoid of the imposition of collective identity, versus the left, who argue that actually the real problem isn't so much the state as it is prejudice, and the focus should be on liberation from prejudice, liberation from prejudice, prejudgment due to your race or disability or gender or anything else. And it really is that logistical disagreement. You know, they don't really have a higher ideal that they're really striving towards in terms of that, something that they can kind of construct something positive around, a hierarchy, a way of conceiving the world. It's all negative. You know, the ideal is this ideal of authenticity, but really to get there, it's more about destroying what's in the way of that than creating the conditions for that to exist. And so they need a boogeyman. That's why the boogeyman, the evil figure, is so important to this way of looking at things, because it's negative, because it's about liberation. It's about destroying what's in the way of liberating you. And this is why, you know, people make fun of like the conservatives that are always calling the left the real fascists or whatever. And, you know, the right conservatives justify their beliefs by, you know, without these values, think of Jordan Peterson, you know, without these values, without us making these values of individual rights and the ethic of individualism, without making that sacrosanct, you end up with gulags. And I have communist memorabilia everywhere, and I have like Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago here that I reread every year, because I want to remind myself, you know, this is the ultimate evil that he anchors his worldview around, right? And the leftists, the ultimate evil that they anchor their worldview around is World War II and is terrible evils of the Nazis and is preventing genocide. So they're both, you know, when you have complete relativism and you don't have a moral good, you don't have God that you can orient things towards, you don't have some kind of platonic ideal of the good or the virtuous man, some kind of stoic conception of things, you know, that we should be striving towards virtue, eudaimonia. We've done away with that because people aren't able to reason about that, because all of that has been, you know, done away with, and all we have is instrumental reason. What we can create is a negative. We can create the evil that we're preventing. You know, we're not actually imposing anything on you. You know, we're not, because, you know, to impose something on the authentic individual would be the worst thing. So we're not imposing anything on you. What we're protecting people from potential for genocide, for tyranny. So it is this kind of logistical disagreement where, you know, the right says that market mechanisms and individual freedom and institutions like private property are the best mechanism for preventing the imposition of collective will through tyranny. And the left says that an attack on prejudice, a deconstruction of pre-given identities that conflict with individual self-expressive identities, attacking them even through the means of the state, through state socialism and so on, attacking them and destroying those primordial attachments and identities. That's the best way to move to a transhuman future where we can have complete creative freedom to self-express and live authentically. So there is a kind of greater ethic underneath it. There is this idea of authentic living, of self-expression. You know, I always kind of laugh at these like pop philosophy channels on YouTube, like School of Life, and it's all, or you like the person you meet that they're like, oh, I like philosophy, and you know, it's like Albert Camus and some Nietzsche quotes and some Kierkegaard quotes, and like philosophy is just like this kind of self-help thing about, like, you know, they read a synopsis on Camus, and philosophy is all about like finding who you are and like good metaphors for being authentic in a cruel world or something, you know. Ethics and metaphysics and ontology and all this stuff, that was just like stuff people did like thousands of years ago before we discovered science. I mean, I've studied philosophy in college, and this was like, you know, this is like what most of the people thought there. It's like, oh yeah, you know, metaphysics, that's like a nice quaint idea. That's like, you know, they just learned this stuff as like kind of just like a historical study of like, you know, these people in Mesoamerica used to believe in this bird god or something. And it's like, oh, like the Greeks used to believe in this thing called metaphysics. So everything is reduced to the banal. Everything is banal. Everything is banal except preventing the great evil of tyranny and of nationalism and of, God forbid, you know, harsh religion and the Crusades and, you know, all these bad things, the Inquisition and the gulags and all this kind of stuff. So that's why, you know, when people attack the communists, like, oh, they're authoritarian, they want to put everyone in gulags, they just want power, they love dictatorship and all this. It's like, no, they're like, you know, they're all about individualism and doing whatever you want and like spiting your parents and like, you know, again, this ideal of people just kind of doing whatever they want and just sort of creatively just forcing their will on the world in any way they see fit, on any particular whim, without any objective standard that they're trying to obey or whatever, free from tradition. And this is the whole ethic that drives political discourse across the spectrum, and it's literally becoming impossible to even have a discussion outside of these bounds without just sounding like an insane person. So that's why I don't watch my debates anymore, political debates. I'm kind of cynical about the worth of debating. You know, these people like Molyneux and Destiny, they're sophists, they win debates, but, you know, there's a deeper rot going on here, and there's a deeper ethic at play that I think people need to understand. And it isn't just like relativism and like they just hate white people, they just hate Christianity. There's a deeper ethic that people are striving towards, that you can see expressed in culture and in all the platitudes about living your life to the fullest and self-discovery and so on. So yeah, that's some thoughts on that debate.